Depending on the type of narration chosen by the author, a story occasionally might shift perspective over to the antagonist. We get to see the villain's thought process, including what their current plans are for ridding themselves of the hero. And we occasionally witness a reminder of how evil they are. This is the kick the puppy trope. The villain does something totally reprehensible according to the audience, something that no good person would ever do. Hence the naming convention for the trope. This makes the audience consider the antagonist to have little to no redeeming qualities. Such villain moments in the story also tend to include their lackeys, some almost as reprehensible as the antagonists themselves. And if the author wishes to showcase the utter horror of the villain's kick-the-puppy evil, some of the villain's lackeys will shudder at carrying out the boss's plans. And ultimately, these antagonist spotlight moments push forward the plot of the story. They're one more reason for the protagonist to rise up against their opponent, one more evil to be righted. These storytelling tropes stand, in part, because things like this happen in our real world with people who work against the plan of God. People who've set themselves against the restoration of the humble. It's part of the reason why our series' driving theme begins the way that it does. Despite the problems of this life and the human evil that brings them about, God's king will reign and bring restoration to his humble people. There are many whose evil brings about the problems of this life. The things that we struggle with are in part because of the sins of other people. And more than a few of these could have their stories told in this villainous manner. One of which we'll look at in our passage for this sermon, 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 6 to 23. And the worst part of this particular example was that this antagonist was once a hero in the story. Throughout our time in the book of Samuel, we've seen Saul do many good things. He worked God's justice on more than one occasion. But as we've witnessed since just before David came onto the scene, Saul's failures have led to more and worse failures. And while Saul's evil work against the plan of God has mostly been directed at David, in this villainous spotlight, we'll witness him do something completely reprehensible to other innocents. But we should remember through it all that Saul's evil deeds don't derail the plan of God. The evils of this life are as a result of human sins and deeds. Yet even through the freely chosen evil of humanity's whims, God will not be stopped. The sinful aspects of humanity might even end up bringing parts of the plan of God to fruition, while attempting to thwart that very plan. But enough introduction of this antagonistic moment. Let's get to the passage. And we begin with the villain in his lair, surrounded by his lackeys, including one just introduced in the last sermon. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 6 to 10. Now Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men who were with him. Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, Hear now, people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? That all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. There's a lot to go over here. And we're only 5 verses into this passage. I mean, even our very first verse, verse 6, has quite a bit to go over here. First, Saul heard that David had been seen out and about. He'd crawled out of whatever hole he'd been hiding in. Remember, at the end of the last sermon, David and his 400-plus man army had left the cave-like stronghold, at the command of God through the voice of the prophet Gad. They'd gone into the tribal lands of Judah to finally begin the work that God had prepared for them. After months or longer of hiding, David's presence had been whispered about finally. And word of this came to Saul. The eye of the enemy finally had a general direction to go. After all, Saul had been without God's help for a while now. No prophet but himself. And the priests were no help to him either. Then, after we realize the terrible truth of Saul's knowledge about the rumors of David's location, we see Saul sitting in his lair, surrounded by his lackeys. He's somewhere near his hometown of Gibeah, under a tree. This isn't the first time that we've witnessed Saul in the outskirts of Gibeah under a tree, waiting for something to happen when he should be doing God's work, while an actual man of God does the work that should be done by God's chosen king. In 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 2, it was a pomegranate tree instead of a tamarisk, and Jonathan was the one fighting Philistines instead of David facing off against the rejected King Saul. But the parallels are certainly there otherwise. Saul's just sitting there with his yes-men surrounding him instead of actually doing kingly work. Oh, there is one other difference between the two scenes. In chapter 22, Saul has added his spear. He seems to have it close at hand at all times now, paranoia seeming to keep the king sleep with his weapon close at hand. Breaking into this opening picture, maybe right when the rumors of David's position came to be known by Saul, frustration overcomes him, and he growls into the quiet mewlings of his underlings. Listen, people, I have something to say. Even the way Saul begins to speak reeks of his frustration. Our translations show him referring to his lackeys as people of Benjamin, or men of Benjamin, or even just Benjamites. But the Hebrew actually refers to them as sons of Benjamin. Now, while these all basically say the same thing, and in our politically correct society we prefer less masculine collectives, this phrasing is more important considering something that we already know about Saul. When he wants to demean or belittle someone, what does Saul use to say it? He calls them a son of something. I mean, we see him call David son of Jesse in just the next few words. We've witnessed many other examples of that. And when Saul was angry at Jonathan, he calls him a son of a expletive woman. Saul calling people that he's mad at son of something reveals to all listening that he's already angry at them. He views himself as better than them. They deserve to be put down in his mind. So when Saul refers to his own yes-men as sons of Benjamin, he's not just trying to get the attention of those of his own tribe, the people that he's put in positions of power. No, he's about to blow at the rumors concerning David's whereabouts, and he's aiming it right at his own lackeys. His frustration obvious from almost the very first word out of his mouth. And what was he angry about? Not just that the son of Jesse's finally been seen in the lands of Judah, but that these fools around him weren't the ones to tell him. It's almost like, according to his mad logic, that these lackeys are conspiring against him to put the son of Jesse on the throne themselves. And so he asks these sons of Benjamin if the son of Jesse would give them such a good life as Saul gives them. Do you really think that the son of Jesse, a man from the tribe of Judah, will give people who are not from his tribe good positions? Do you not think that he'd do the same type of thing that I did and give positions of power to the people close to him, his family, his clan, his tribe? Nepotism doesn't flow your way, O sons of Benjamin, unless I'm still king. I'm trying to help you out here, and it looks like you want the son of Jesse to be your king too. The whole thing reminds him of how even Jonathan seems to want David to be king. Saul had tried to point out to his own son that he was helping him by ensuring that the dynasty would flow through him, that there'd be a King Jonathan one day. But even that had failed. And now Saul is wondering if the rest of his court held the same opinion as Jonathan. And the thought about his own son reminded Saul of another thing, too. He blames his lackeys for not letting him know that Jonathan had made a covenant with the son of Jesse. It's bad enough when the crowned prince is part of the conspiracy to dethrone Saul. But could his closest advisors be in on this conspiracy too? The frustration at this whole thing makes Saul voice his fears before them. No wonder he's not letting that spear out of his hand, until he tries to throw it at the first person who looks at him wrong. And as the king vents his frustration, Doeg the Edomite finds an opportunity to advance his position, leverage some political power. It's important to point out here that an Edomite is someone who is outside of the family of Israel. Edom is another name for Esau, who was Jacob's twin brother. And remember, Jacob was given the name Israel by God, hence the name of the nation. You know, lots of people in the Bible seem to have multiple names for one reason or another. And so, as an Edomite, Doeg would be one of those few in Saul's inner circle who was not a product of nepotism. He has to earn his promotions. And that's what he's trying to do here. Of course, it doesn't hurt that what he's about to do here is actually him doing his job as chief shepherd, or master spy, as we talked about in the last sermon. With the accusation of no one being on Saul's side, Doeg pipes up, "Oh yeah, when I was in Nob, I saw the son of Jesse." Notice how Doeg follows suit by calling David the same deriding title that his boss does? You know, typical lackey behavior, parroting the big bad's vocabulary. Fortunately, Doeg's failure to mention this last meeting before now is overshadowed by the severity of the news that he reports. The son of Jesse had met with the high priest and been given provisions and the sword of Goliath. The little tattletale lets it all come out. And Saul saw red. A meeting with a representative of God could only mean that the son of Jesse wanted some divine guidance. And since Saul knew that God was against him, that was terrible news. Not to mention that the aid of provisions meant that he couldn't starve the little usurper out. And the sword of Goliath was a symbol of the moment when the people's allegiance moved from Saul to the son of Jesse. Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s. So Saul sends for the seditious high priest to kick the puppy. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 11 and 19. Then the king sent to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were at Nob. And all of them came to the king. And Saul said, Hear now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, Here I am, my lord. And Saul said to him, Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait, as at this day? Then Ahimelech answered the king, And who among all your servants is so faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard, and honored in your house? Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all of this, much or little. And the king said, You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. And the king said to the guard who stood about him, Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand is also with David. And they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, You turn and strike the priests. And Doeg turned and struck down the priests. And he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword, both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep, he put to the sword. Saul sent for Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. What, is the narrator now getting caught up in this calling people son of something too? No, this time there's something else important that the author's trying to say. And that importance also points us back to a couple of earlier chapters. In part it points us back again to chapter 14, though verse 3 this time, which tells us that Ahimelech, or Ahijah as he's called there, I told you lots of biblical people have multiple names, was the son of Ahitub, who was the brother of Ichabod, Mr. No Glory himself, who was the son of Phinehas, who was the son of Eli. Thus the mentioning of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, by the author is to remind his audience that Ahimelech is Eli's great-grandson. It's a little hint that even in this terrible deed that Saul is about to do, God is still in control. I know that it's been a little while since we've been in the part of Samuel that deals with Eli's failure, back at the beginning of this whole thing. But remember that there had been a curse placed upon his house because he had failed to stop his sons from abusing their positions as priests. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 31 to 33, God told the aging priest Eli that God would cut off the strength of Eli and his father's house. Keep that phrasing of father's house for later. No one else would ever be considered an old man among all of Eli's household. Everyone would die before their time from then on. They'd all die by the swords of men, all except for one. And that one who was not cut off from God's altar will be spared to weep his eyes out because of the grief in his heart. And the proof of this prophecy from God to Eli would be that Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's sons, would die on the same day, which did come to pass. Well, now we're in the later part of that prophecy from earlier in the book. The author's dropping a hint about what's going to happen before it does. Those paying close attention should have realized the importance of the author reminding us that Ahimelech is the son of Ahitub. But we get a little ahead of the story. So let's get back to the scene. Saul sent for Ahimelech, the priest, who was the son of Ahitub, and also sent for Ahimelech's father's house. There's that phrasing about father's house again. Anyway, with the priest standing in front of him, Saul speaks to Ahimelech, whom Saul does indeed refer to with the belittling son of Ahitub. And Ahimelech responds with the Hebrew word Hineni. There was something important about that word, wasn't there? Oh yeah, it's a word that quite often is spoken to God, when one of his servants humbly accepts the call of God for his purpose. But Ahimelech is talking directly to Saul, not God, so it couldn't be used in that manner here. Or could it? Ahimelech already acted in the role of provider for God's humble servant in the last sermon. He had already worked the plan of God. And remember, I truly believe that Ahimelech knew what he was doing regardless of the fact of his denial here. And now, he was paying the consequences for that enacted plan of God. That Hineni was Ahimelech's acceptance of God's plan, both for David and for his father's house. There was so much subtext going on in this puppy-kicking moment. And Saul lays out his accusation in verse 13. Conspiracy against the king by allying himself with the son of Jesse. Ahimelech had provided advice from God, food, and a sword for a known fugitive. But Ahimelech claimed ignorance. It wasn't like this is the first time that David had inquired of God for Saul. After all, Saul certainly wouldn't come for himself. Not that close to God. And as far as Ahimelech and the people of Nob knew, David was still in good standing with Saul. A faithful servant, captain of the bodyguard, and the king's son-in-law. Why wouldn't he provide direction from God to such a faithful servant? There was no blame to lay at the feet of Ahimelech or at the feet of his father's house. They didn't know any better at the time. But Saul didn't believe him. Notice how angry he is at Ahimelech in this moment. That he fails to call David the son of Jesse in verse 17. Saul's ire burned hotter against this son of Ahitub than against David in this moment. And so the villain kicks the puppy. He orders the death of Ahimelech and his father's house. Strangely, as someone who is now opposing God, this once hero turned villain carries out the work of God by completing his curse against the house of Eli. But Saul would never do such a dirty deed by his own hand, so he commands the guards with him to execute the priests. They might be yes men, but those guards did not want anything to do with killing the priests of God. The task was reprehensible even to the lackeys of the antagonist. They would never do such a thing. So Saul turns to the only underling that he still seems to be able to trust, and he commands Doeg to do the deed. And so, by the sword of a man, 85 members of the house of Eli fell. And by the sword of men, his father's house in Nob fell. Notice one more interesting thing about the sword that wiped out an entire town. It lists out man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep. Does that list sound familiar to anyone else? It's not exact, sure, but the parallel is too great to be a coincidence. Besides, I doubt that the priest of Nob would have used camels that much. Remember, back in chapter 15, God had commanded Saul to kill the people of Amalek. God had said to utterly destroy them, man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. But Saul kept the king of Amalek alive, and had allowed the people to take some of the spoils supposedly for a sacrifice to God. He'd refused to listen to God's direct command. This was the failure that had led Saul to be totally rejected by God. The big event in his fall from rising hope. And now in chapter 22, it is paralleled in his villainous act of puppy kicking. We witness the parallel between his final failure as hero and his darkest act as villain. I mean, it looks like Saul can utterly wipe out a town, just not when God tells him to. Although that doesn't mean that God hadn't known it would happen beforehand. God still used an enemy of his plan to carry out his work, while Saul, in his anger, did a reprehensible act of killing innocent priests in Nob. His choice still enacted a prophesied curse by God against the house of Eli. Despite the problems of this life and the human evil that brings them about, God's king will reign and bring restoration to his humble people. In spite of the fact that the enemies of God will choose to do their acts of evil against many, they can do nothing that undoes the work of restoration that God has planned from the foundation of the world. Even in their choice to do evil, God's divine plan continues unhindered. They might even be fulfilling one part of God's plan, while they fight against another part. This is what Saul does here in 1 Samuel chapter 22. But there was one last part of that prophecy from chapter 2. The one who is not cut off from God's altar will be spared to weep his eyes out because of the grief in his heart. Where is the one who escaped? Running straight toward God's chosen king. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 20 to 23. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safe keeping. That one member of his father's house who escaped was Abiathar. How he got away, we don't really know. God's plan will work as he wills. So it was likely with divine protection that Abiathar escaped. But what is important is that he found God's chosen king. And Abiathar told David everything that Saul did. I mean, there has to be someone to report to the protagonist of the story that the antagonist had performed his evil act. But I want you to notice David's response. It's not rage at Saul for such a terrible deed, nor burning anger at Doeg for being the one who bore Saul's reprehensible sword. And it's also not a calculating thought about how he could use this dirt against Saul in his political coup. No. David's response is grief at his own role in this event. He'd seen Doeg in Nob. He knew that Doeg was the master spy in Saul's court. Word of his presence there would eventually get back to Saul. His mercy at not assassinating Doeg had directly led to the slaughter of hundreds of people. David lamented his part in the obliteration of Nob, despite the fact that it happened by the sword of Doeg, despite the fact that it was all commanded by Saul, and even despite the fact that the events were used by God for his curse against Eli's family. Despite it all, David lamented for his part. We have to see that David never blamed God for the enactment of this prophesied curse. David only lamented his small part in this horrendous act, and because of his broken heart over the whole thing, he didn't just stop with his sorrow. He wasn't just sad and then went on his way. No, he acted. David took Abiathar under his protection. There was action joined with his disgust in Saul's villainous act. Because the same man wanted both David and Abiathar dead, the safest place that the priest could be was with God's chosen king. And you know what? There's one last part of God's restorative plan in motion here. Not only was David the anointed and chosen king through whom God worked his plan, and not only did David have the prophet Gad with him, a representation of God's presence through one of his mouthpieces, but now, the last member of Eli's high priestly line was with David. The king had a prophet of God and the high priest with him. None could deny the way this looked. God was with David. And Saul, the mad king who could break into prophetic ravings just as soon as chuck a spear at you, he was all alone. Saul might have the power of the state behind him, but that backing of a fickle people was nothing in the face of one with God on his side. There are a few passages in the book of Samuel that could more easily represent the theme of our series than this one. Despite the problems of this life and the human evil that brings them about, God's king will reign and bring restoration to his humble people. No villainous act of evil humanity can ever derail the restorative plan of God. At worst, those who work against God will draw the eye of his justice and raise up those whom he chooses to exact it. And at best, their evil acts will actually work out part of God's plan. I know that there are some wondering how God could ever allow evil like this to happen. Why couldn't God just have let Saul die, stop his heart from pumping, deny him air that he breathes? Truthfully, if you're asking that kind of question, I can't really give you a reason that'll sound satisfactory. Any attempt will only create contempt. All that I can say is that it's humanity's choice to work against God that causes the problems of this world. And though God may allow evil to happen, even use that evil as a part of his plan, his restorative plan will never be derailed or undone. In that much we can find a sure hope. The greatest example of all of this is the same as our only hope. The death of Jesus on the cross was the work of evil and jealous people, along with the machinations of Satan and his angelic lackeys. They chose to execute the God who could save them, just as we choose to work against God every time we sin. But God used that evil act of the cross to bring about the climax of his restorative plan. The salvation that frees us from our sin came as a result of enemies of God choosing to perform an evil act. We can weep and wail, join Abiathar in grieving his eyes out as survivors of every villainous moment in our lives. No one is saying that we should just grin and bear it. No one's telling us that our grief is unfounded. No one shuts our mouths to keep us from lament. But as we run to God's chosen King, to Jesus our Savior, let us experience his welcoming embrace that calls us to peace and safety in his presence. For the evil that seeks to steal every aspect of life from us already sought to steal his life. But he gave it for us, and then came back to life. Death itself couldn't stop the plan of God. Why would we ever fear that any other enemy of our God could do anything more? We will experience more problems of this life tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. And though I pray that some good days will pass for us in between, those problems won't go away completely in this life. But we have a King who brought restoration through his death. Despite our weeping, we have a place of safety to run to. And the worst that our enemies can do against his plan is work in concert with it.